Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch. I'm your host, Vikas Swarup. Tonight, our focus will be on a region that has become the power center of world geopolitics. A region that is home to 64% of the world's population and hosts 20 of the world's 33 megacities. A region through which half of all global trade, almost two-thirds of global oil shipments, and a third of bulk cargo transits. A region which accounts for 62% of the global GDP and whose security, stability, peace and prosperity is vital for the entire world. I'm talking about the Indo-Pacific, which is both a geographical region and a geopolitical construct. But it is imagined essentially as a maritime space based on the confluence of the two oceans, the Indian and the Pacific. For India, the importance of the Indo-Pacific cannot be overemphasized. As a maritime power, India's security and economic interests range all the way from the western coast of North America to the eastern shores of Africa. That is why the adoption of the term Indo-Pacific by the United States and several other major powers represents an acknowledgement of India's widening interests, globalized activities, and broadening strategic horizon. India's approach to the Indo-Pacific has been laid out by Prime Minister Narendra Modi in a series of policy speeches. In 2015, in the context of the Indian Ocean, he had spoken of SAGAR, an acronym for Security and Growth for All in the region. At the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore in 2018, Prime Minister Modi articulated India's positive vision for the Indo-Pacific, one that seeks a free, open, inclusive, peaceful and prosperous Indo-Pacific built on a rules-based order and underpinned by the centrality of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations or ASEAN. India envisages a region which should have freedom of navigation and overflight, unimpeded lawful commerce, mutual respect for sovereignty, peaceful resolution of disputes, and equality amongst nations. In 2019, at the East Asia Summit in Bangkok, Prime Minister Modi announced the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative to support the building of a rules-based regional architecture centered on 7 pillars: maritime security, maritime ecology, maritime resources, capacity building and resource sharing, disaster risk reduction and management, science, technology and academic cooperation, and trade, connectivity, and maritime transport. India's Indo-Pacific strategy rests on 2 main pillars: strengthening its national engagement with the region and stronger partnerships with like-minded nations. India has sought to strengthen security and freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific by becoming a net security provider and establishing itself as an early responder in the area of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. India's inclusive vision of the Indo-Pacific is shared by many other countries and organizations. The United States, Germany, France, the UK, the Netherlands, Australia, Japan, the EU and ASEAN have all come out with their own strategies for deepening their engagement with the Indo-Pacific. But now, suddenly, the focus of the world has shifted to Europe. As the war in Ukraine continues to rage and the West continues to pile economic sanctions on Russia, there is increasing talk of a new Cold War between East and West. With the United States now focused on taming Russia and leveraging all its alliances towards reorienting European energy security, what does this mean for the US commitment to the Indo-Pacific? And how will the war in Ukraine and the spiraling prices of oil and gas impact the geopolitics and geoeconomics of this vital region? In this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch, we will examine these and related issues by calling upon 2 outstanding experts. With me in the studio is Mr. Pramit Chaudhuri, the foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, with 3 decades of experience in tracking international politics and economics. He is a visiting fellow at the Ananta Aspen Center and served 2 terms from 2011 to 2015 on the National Security Advisory Board of India. And joining us all the way from Canberra is Professor Rory Metcalf, one of Australia's most prominent strategic thinkers. He is head of the National Security College at the Australian National University, and his professional background involves more than 30 years of experience across diplomacy, intelligence analysis, think tanks, academia, and journalism, including as founding director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute from 2007 to 2015. He is also the author of a recent book titled Contest for the Indo-Pacific: Why China Won't Map the Future. Let me begin with you, Professor Metcalf. As you write in your book, the North Atlantic was the global center of economic and political gravity for much of the 19th and 20th centuries. But in the 21st century, that center has shifted decidedly eastwards to the region now defined as the Indo-Pacific. How has the Indo-Pacific risen in salience in international affairs, and why has this new construct seized the imagination of so many countries?
Look, thank you, Vikas. It's a great question. I have tracked the evolution of the Indo-Pacific idea over the past 20 years or so. In fact, going back to when I worked in Delhi at the Australian High Commission at the turn of the century. And I've tracked the evolution of this idea. Indeed, I've encouraged it along with other analysts and scholars. Why is it so special? Why is this the Indo-Pacific moment in world history? A lot is to do with the shift towards, a multipolar strategic environment in our region, the impact of the rise of China, but not only China, the rise of India as a major power regionally and globally, the growth of connectivity across the seas, of trade and investment, and the security footprint that accompanies all of that. I guess the simple way of explaining this is that in the late 20th century, we went through a so-called Asia-Pacific moment where the connections and the engagement between East Asia and North America, and indeed Australasia as well, were apparent, underpinning the American security role in the region, the growth of the East Asian economies. But from at least the 1990s onwards, we've seen a two-ocean system, the Indo-Pacific, the connections between East Asia and Southeast Asia, the global trade and energy routes, and the rise of so many military powers in the region, all with an increased convergence on the role of the Indian Ocean and the sea lanes of Southeast Asia as being really central to global affairs. And so whether it's Australia or India or Japan or a number of other countries, there is, as you say, a fundamental turn to Indo-Pacific strategic frameworks, which not only describe this new regional vision, but also provide the foundations for the biggest challenge, which is how to manage disruptive power from the rise of China. And that's indeed, as you say, the subject of my book.
Thank you so much, Professor Metcalf. Now, Pramit, one of the reasons why the US dropped the term Asia-Pacific and began using Indo-Pacific was to recognize India's economic and security interests in the region. So why is India important to the Indo-Pacific?
Well, because partly I think that it's not just the economics of this. In 2008, India passed $1 trillion in terms of GDP. Now we're $3 trillion. And if the trajectories are correct, and most of the analysis, we'll easily double that over the next 10 years, and the numbers will keep just getting better. Second, at the heart of the strategic construct of the Indo-Pacific, especially from the American point of view, but definitely from ours as well, is the problem, the challenge of China. How do you ensure that China stays within the norms of the international system, especially in this region? And I would argue, and I think definitely that's the view of the United States in particular, but definitely of Japan and I think Australia, that that's not really possible without India coming into the picture. Not only because of the sheer size of the Indian military, but also because of the pugnaciousness with which India handles China. And then the sheer demographics, if you wish. Japan in particular, economically extremely powerful, but a demographic disaster in many ways. So a lot of these countries I think, assume that without India, a lot of the things such as the Quad will not really work properly. And definitely for China, the odds are stacked in their favor. So we've become crucial to this. And I think one of the big shifts for the United States has been, one, in recognition that China is their number one strategic problem. The other element is a recognition that India is prepared to take on China much more strongly, perhaps, than almost any other country in this region. And we've actually seen bloodshed on our border. And the Chinese themselves recognize that at least this is one country that they will continue to have problems with ever bringing any degree of closeness. And if you've seen what's happening economically, I would argue we're probably the most vicious in terms of cutting out Chinese investment. Chinese FDI to India has fallen 74% in the past 1 year, even while overall FDI from the rest of the world in India has increased.
Now, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has called the Indo-Pacific an attention-grabbing idea that will dissipate like ocean foam. Tell us, why is China troubled by this term?
Well, I think it was fantastic advertising for the idea of the Indo-Pacific, for it to be so roundly condemned by the Chinese government. And of course, Wang Yi said that, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago. And ever since then, the Indo-Pacific has become more popular, more influential. Like the Quad, it's here to stay. Why is China worried? It's not just because the Indo-Pacific includes the word Indo and obviously to some extent privileges the role of India in the region as it should, but it's actually because the Indo-Pacific is a concept that rationalizes and indeed justifies the balancing behavior, the coalition building of a diverse range of countries across this vast strategic space. The fact that we've got the Quad, that we've got arrangements that bring in ASEAN partners, Australia, India, Indonesia, the fact that, of course, now AUKUS is being, if you like, developed under an Indo-Pacific rubric. All of these diverse and different arrangements are about harnessing the power of the many to stabilize the region and not to exclude China, but to incorporate China into a regional framework that it cannot dominate. And that clearly is at odds with China's strategic agenda, and hence the frustration with the Indo-Pacific idea that we've been hearing. But I would argue, and I argue in my book, that the Indo-Pacific idea is winning out over time, because deep down, and maybe we'll get to this later on, deep down, China's own Belt and Road and Maritime Silk Road and all of its plans and plots across the region actually have an Indo-Pacific character. In a sense, China is the inadvertent creator of the Indo-Pacific itself.
That's a very unique perspective indeed. Now, Pramit, the Indo-Pacific is now the standard American lens for the region. The United States renamed its oldest and largest military command, the Pacific Command, to Indo-Pacific Command in 2018. Every policy speech from the White House, every strategic document from the Pentagon, and every piece of relevant legislation in the US Congress speaks of the Indo-Pacific and the strategic threat from China. Last June, President Biden held a summit meeting with President Putin to explore the possibility of a reasonable relationship with Moscow, distance it from China, and focus all of America's energies on the Indo-Pacific. But will the war in Ukraine change all that? Does the US have the bandwidth to take on both Russia and China at the same time?
Good question. I think right now, yes, no. I mean, in the sense that Washington's obvious is handling a crisis. So automatically everything that they're doing right now is very much focused on the Ukraine. And that's very clear. You talk to anybody in Washington. But one of the key reasons that America decided not to give us a hard time about our refusal to vote against Russia is because they see India still as absolutely essential to their Indo-Pacific strategy. And they accept that while India is highly invested in the Indo-Pacific, its interests in the Black Sea are obviously quite minimal. And therefore, you can see that at the highest level, there's now almost no pressure on India regarding our Ukraine policy or the lack, if you wish, thereof. But no, America obviously doesn't want or doesn't. You can see if you look at the interim national security guidelines that were issued by the Biden administration, I think 3 months after it came to office. it says that America must now reduce itself effectively to two key strategic areas, the Indo-Pacific and the Atlantic.
Yes.
I mean, Latin America is assumed not to be a problem. And noticeably Central Asia, not even mentioned. Middle East downgraded to the same level as Africa. Basically, we have to cut our losses. We're in a sort of imperial overstretch problem here. And we are facing a peer rival in the form of China that really is almost unprecedented in American history. The Soviet Union is almost nothing in comparison to the kind of clout that China brings to the table. So the Ukraine thing I would argue, will be an enormous distraction because it will consume the politics of the Biden administration. But it's noticeable that America continues to say that we are vested in the Indo-Pacific. They are concerned enough about the possibility of China using this to take a poke at Taiwan that, if I'm correct, they mobilized 4 aircraft carriers into the Taiwan area and asked the Japanese to send in their, quote, destroyer, which happens to be the size of a carrier. And so you actually had an enormous array of American military power outside in the South China Sea, Taiwan area. So very clearly, they remain concerned. And I think geopolitically for the Americans, and I think this is also, my understanding is also true in the Indian government's assessment, is that in many ways Ukraine is useful in the long run, the Ukraine war, because the one pole, if you wish, that has been sitting on the fence regarding China, which is Europe, or the European Union in particular, has now begun to say that, yes, we have to take a geopolitical decision other than just worrying about whether they can make some money. So I would argue, no, America right now in the short term will be very focused on the Ukraine, but it still remains a fact that they recognize that China remains their long-term concern. I mean, ultimately, as the Americans keep emphasizing, Russia's GDP is the size of Texas. Yeah. And it's 40% of India's. It has a legacy of a superpower, but it no longer has the actual capacity of a superpower. And at some point or another, it's not going to be able to sustain what happens in the Ukraine.
Professor Metcalf, the war in Ukraine and the raising of the nuclear threat is causing several countries in the Indo-Pacific to revisit their strategic calculus. Japan is rethinking its nuclear abstinence. South Korea's new president wants to strengthen ties with the US and explore potential cooperation with the Quad. Australia, as you said, is now part of the AUKUS and will soon have nuclear-powered submarines. The countries of the ASEAN are also having to adapt rapidly to the new US confrontation with both Russia and China. So how will the crisis in Ukraine impact the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region?
So I think Pramit's message is really important, and that is the geopolitical awakening that the Ukraine conflict, that Russia's aggression really has prompted. And that is in Europe, but it's also in the Indo-Pacific. The consequences will play out, I think, over many years, but we're seeing an absolute recognition across this region now that the risk of major war is real, that the Russia-China alignment is something we need to think very, very closely about, and that nations, while in many cases like Australia and Japan, we have formal alliances with the United States, we can be confident of America's help. Nonetheless, we have to do more for our own capabilities. We have to carry more of the security burden. So in fact, I think that this is going to make life harder for China in its efforts to dominate the Indo-Pacific, not easier. It is going to force all sorts of rude awakenings. I think it's too early to talk too seriously about Japan going nuclear. And of course, the Australian nuclear submarine plan under AUKUS is a very long-term plan, and it was already underway well before Ukraine. But this is going to be a global turning point. It's just that I think in the long run, the consequences will be bad for the authoritarians, not good for them.
Pramit, a far more direct impact will be felt in the geoeconomics of the Indo-Pacific, with oil and gas prices touching record levels, just as the countries of the region were trying to emerge from the COVID crisis. So how do you see the economic fallout of the war in Ukraine on the Indo-Pacific?
The real impact is that global oil prices and gas prices are linked together. So no matter where we may be able to assure supplies of oil, but the price will keep rising. Now, oil, fortunately, so far, the supply-demand issue is not a concern, because while, let's say, America has decided not to buy Russian oil, the result is that it's just gone and bought exactly the same kind of oil from Brazil, which has now stopped selling that to China, but China is now picking it up from Russia. The end result is the same. Gas, however, is different. Gas is not a very efficient market because it has to be moved through either pipelines or ships and LNG terminals. Russia's gas cannot be transferred to any place except Europe. There aren't enough pipelines for it to move to Asia. So if by chance they are sanctioned on that front, then it'll be a disaster for gas, because that entire supply will disappear and cannot be replaced in a hurry. So that is something, obviously, the Indian system is nervous about. We're not concerned about the rise in wheat prices. India is a net exporter. If anything, there's now talk that India might benefit by about $8 to $10 billion worth of exports by the wheat. The real issue, I think, is just the global uncertainty. The reason why oil prices are going up and down is not a supply-demand issue. It's just a risk premium. Nobody knows what's going to happen.
Professor Metcalf, you write in your book that the signature Belt and Road Initiative of Chinese leader Xi Jinping is part infrastructure and lending spree, part strategic power play, and part marketing campaign. But the Maritime Silk Road's eventual game plan is to have a region dominated by China, or, as you put it, an Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics. How will the continued slowdown in the global economy caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and now the war in Ukraine impact the BRI?
That's a really good and complex question, Vikas. I mean, I think that the BRI, the Belt and Road, or One Belt, One Road, as it was originally called in Chinese, and really defines it as being an imperial project. This is a signature project for Xi Jinping. It has, if you like, raised the alarm bells in countries like India and Australia, because it really was investment and infrastructure with lots of influence strings attached for Chinese power. And if you track back a few years, it was the dominant story about China's engagement with the region. In fact, one of the themes of my book is the imperial character of it. I think you mentioned the name of the original edition of my book, Contest for the Indo-Pacific. The international edition is called Indo-Pacific Empire, precisely because it's about the imperial pretensions that China has through the BRI. But this is changing. I think the BRI is in trouble, as it always was going to be, and it's in trouble for a couple of reasons. One is, of course, that other countries are waking up. I think India, in fact, led that wake up in 2017 when its government, I recall I think the Ministry of External Affairs put out a very clear statement listing the conditions under which India would sign up to Belt and Road projects. And those conditions were all very reasonable, about environmental sustainability, consultation with local populations, good commercial returns, all of the things you would expect from a decent investment. And these were not the conditions, in fact, that were accompanying the BRI. And other countries have woken up, Australia, the United States, a lot of our European friends. And the BRI is now in competition with alternative infrastructure and development arrangements from India, from Japan, from Australia, the US, from Europe, to help those countries in the middle, Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean Island states, the small Pacific states, to help them with their development. So the BRI was in trouble already. COVID and the impact of COVID on China's engagement with the world, the damage it's done to trust in China, very low levels of trust now, the closure of Chinese society to travel, in fact, the semi-closure of the Chinese economy, that too has put a dent into the BRI project. And then finally, I think you're right, we don't know yet what the full impact of the Ukraine conflict will be. But I think if China now finds itself in this unlimited friendship with a Russia that could well find itself a weakening power in the world, that's going to further weaken the glorious ambitions of the Belt and Road.
Pramit, like China, Russia has also not accepted the Indo-Pacific and has consistently spoken against India's membership of the Quad. Now, with the West almost cancelling Russia from Europe, do you see a hardening of Russia's opposition to the Quad?
Yeah, I think one inevitable consequence of the Ukraine war and the sanctions and what's happening there is that India's attempts to at least slow down Russia's drift towards China are effectively over. That was a long and difficult struggle. We didn't expect to do more than slow it down, but it's now clearly a lost cause. One thing that we have to remember about Russia was that even when we had a conflict, I mean, even when we had a military issue with China, Russia was always prepared to provide us military weapons, and to do so on the drop of a hat. I mean, only two countries in the world provide India emergency weapons without a question, even against China. One of them is Israel, the other one is Russia. Now we will obviously have to put that under question, given now China's will almost be completely dominant as far as Russia's futures is concerned. And one of the things we had tried to do is try to get Russia to accept at least a version of the Indo-Pacific that was not about a military containment of China. But Russia had rejected it, but occasionally sometimes would sniff something that maybe they'd be prepared to talk about it. Now I think, yes, that's over. And that's one of the things I think you can already see in the Indian system is Russia has now proved to be, should we say, both unpredictable and in many ways, in India's view, moving against its own long-term interests for very short-term gains, potential short-term gains in Ukraine. So yes, I think the Russian gambit for India is now going to slowly decline. It has to slowly decline because our military dependence on Russia is something that cannot be changed very quickly.
Professor Metcalf, what impact will the conflict in Ukraine have on the Quad? Do you foresee a reorientation of its priorities?
So I think the conflict in Ukraine is going to have all sorts of impacts on the Indo-Pacific, and I think that point about Russia is fascinating. I certainly think that friends of India, like me, think that a recalibration and a reframing of India's interests in the relationship with Russia is very timely. I think it's very necessary for India. The Quad is a context for those conversations because one of the obvious criticisms of the Quad has been, look, these four democracies, their interests do not perfectly align. Even their interpretations of what democratic values look like do not perfectly align. Therefore, there's no point in these four democracies seriously trying to join forces to balance China. And the concerns about India's position, India's abstaining, for example, in the Security Council and the General Assembly on Russia's aggression have heightened some of those concerns, but they have not fatally damaged or injured the Quad. The Quad leaders meeting that was held recently reiterated the focus of the Quad on the Indo-Pacific, by implication, the focus of the Quad on managing and balancing China. Most of the work the Quad is doing is not in a direct military sense. It's to do with delivering public goods to the region and helping Quad partners build themselves up and build one another up. That will all continue, and I hope that the Quad will also be a quiet caucus, if you like, where Quad members help one another in recalibrating their own positions, whether it's India in relation to Russia, whether it's Australia in relation to climate change, for example, where we've been something of a laggard.
Pramit, going forward, what kind of strategy should India craft to deal with emerging challenges in the Indo-Pacific?
At the heart of it, I think, is going to be about the future of critical technologies. So there's about 20 working groups in the Quad which are already working on this. And I think this is, when you talk to people in the Biden administration, they're very clear about this. Who dominates artificial intelligence? Who dominates 5G? Who dominates green hydrogen? Who dominates quantum computing? These are going to determine who is in the top seat in the future. And they can see that China not only is in some areas actually ahead of the rest of us, but is definitely trying to position itself. So, for example, in artificial intelligence, there's an excellent study out of Georgetown University that makes this point that without India's manpower, India generates something like 35% of all the AI experts in the world. There are only 3 countries that really produce them. Even Europe doesn't produce too many, strangely. It's China, the United States, and India. Without the US and India coming together on this, there is no way that America can take on China in artificial intelligence over the next couple of decades. So you need to bring in these components bit by bit, and we have to come through, in my view, on at least 2 or 3 of those technologies, at least set the standards for them in the next 1 to 2 years to show that we're credible.
Thank you, Pramit, and thank you, Dr. Metcalf, for explaining to our viewers so lucidly both the importance of and the dynamics at play in the Indo-Pacific. As India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. S. Jaishankar put it, the Indo-Pacific concept is not tomorrow's forecast, but yesterday's reality. India has vital stakes in this complex, competitive, and contested region. But India can draw strength from the solidarity among the many like-minded nations of the Indo-Pacific and beyond who share India's goal of a multipolar Asia where all countries can prosper equally without coercion from a regional hegemon. That is all in this edition of Diplomatic Dispatch. Join me again next week. Till then, good night and goodbye.